There is an amendment to this bill. Would you like to explain that amendment first, or do you want to wait till after you give your bill and then explain?
I'll explain the amendment now. It simply makes a correction and a percentage that was an error from.
All right. Would you just tell us what that percentage and what that correction is?
Yeah, for the way the introduced version of the bill reads now, students who come from households where the income is between 1.5 times to 2 times the free and reduced lunch level, the way it reads now would allow them to take, I believe it's 90%. The amendment would correct that to 30%.
Thank you, and thank you for doing that, because I didn't quite understand that.
Yeah, it was very understandable.
So if there is no reluctance of this committee not to pass this amendment, then we will pass it unanimously. Hearing no reluctance, we pass that unanimously. Now, would you explain your bill as amended, please?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This bill would create the Oklahoma Education Savings Account Act. It would allow students coming from homes that have low income levels to qualify for and receive a portion of their state and local public school revenue to be deposited into an education savings account. It provides them with opportunities that they wouldn't have coming from a low income home by allowing their parents to direct a portion of their per pupil aid in a way that increases rather than decreases per pupil revenue in the public schools. So it would not be a solution to school funding issues and the per pupil issue that gets raised, but it would certainly work as a benefit to all involved. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you. Representative Condit for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Representative Nelson, well, first of all, I want to ask, is this for educational services, whatever, from preschool or whatever through 12th grade?
Yes.
Follow up?
Yes.
Could you tell me then on page 14, section 8, item A, it states, upon graduation from a post-secondary institution by an eligible student or after a period of 4 consecutive years after high school graduation, if the eligible student is not enrolled in a post-secondary institution, the education savings account of the student shall be closed and any remaining funds shall be returned to the general revenue fund of the state. My question is, why do we need to carry it 4 years, and could the possibility be there that the parents then could use common education money taken from the state to pay for higher education expenses?
Well, that's actually the whole point of it. Any money that's not used from the deposits made while you're in K-12 education can be rolled over and used for post-secondary education. And again, that is to benefit students coming from homes that don't or may not and likely don't have the resources maybe to get them a good start in college.
Follow up.
Okay, can you see where currently I don't think we use any common education money from the State Department of Education to pay for higher education, and under your bill they would be allowed to? Then
you can help correct my understanding that that is in fact the case with concurrent enrollment. Is that not the case with concurrent enrollment?
Do you have an answer for that, Representative Condit?
I see that as almost a different topic, in that yes, it is, but concurrent enrollment also is not limited by income.
All right, thank you.
I'm happy to make this universal.
Representative McDaniel for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Representative Nelson, help me out. I can't find a financial impact study yet on this, but I'm sure there'll be one forthcoming perhaps before we get to the floor, because it seems to me that if I'm a poor person and I qualify for this savings account, SDE, then I can go on a toll-free number or whatever. They'll set up the savings account for me. I withdraw my child from the school, put them in another setting, and then who draws down and who oversees, who takes the money? So I have a private school, let's say in my district, or a charter school, or, well, it wouldn't be charter because that's public school, but let's say I have a private school, or I decide to homeschool my child and use a virtual school. How does that money then go from the savings account into that vendor?
Well, I'll go ahead and try to address your first question and your second one. There is no fiscal impact because you're using existing funds. Students are taking a limited portion of the per pupil revenue that would be generated by that student at the public school. So there is no money that was going to be used to educate the student is still being used to educate the student. The money's just following them. So there is no fiscal impact. To your question here, the money is deposited by the treasurer out of state aid revenue into their account. The parents will receive a debit card that they can use then to make payments to the providers of the parent's choice. There's real-time monitoring of those expenditures because it is electronic. So you can actually limit the vendors, limit those debit cards that they could only be used at with certain vendors, whether it's tutors or private schools or whoever. And then there's a way of monitoring that and addressing it with surety bonds to protect the taxpayer at the board's discretion. So but it goes through the parent. The bill sets up a framework where there's an agreement developed between the state and the parent.
Follow up?
Yes, follow.
So this is like the Lindsay Nicole Henry Scholarship, only we have expanded it to other poor people, not just kids on IEPs. Is that how you would?
It would be similar in the sense that it is designed to help a specific vulnerable student group. Another difference would be you can use it in a lot of different ways. The Henry Scholarship is really limited to being used at brick and mortar private schools. This you can use it in other ways.
As a sort of follow-up, Representative Nelson, on this discussion, could it also be used for homeschooling?
There's an important distinction here. At the request of OCHEC, the Oklahoma Homeschool organization that was just out here the other day, at their request, we've included a specific prohibition for what you would think of as traditional homeschool. At their request, they wanted to be excluded.
All right.
But a parent could still.
They wanted to be excluded, is that correct?
That's correct.
Homeschoolers? Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
But you could use this money to purchase curriculum and materials necessary to educate your child at home.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Representative Candidate for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Nelson, I've got a couple of questions, if I might. Administrative costs on this. Share with me, or us, what the administrative costs are.
Yeah, it's designed to actually work as a savings on administrative costs. It's limited to 5% of what the calculated amount would be. So, and that's of a lower figure. So it's 5% of a smaller figure than what the public school administrative costs are. So it's actually a cost savings.
Follow up.
Okay, that caused a follow-up. So what is the percent of
5%.
administrative costs? No, for this, but for the current school district?
Well, I believe it's between 6 and 8%, and that would just be district administrative costs. That would not include, there's administrative costs in the public system above that. That the law that you're probably thinking of is limited to just the superintendent and staff. And that's actually a 6% to 8% of a much higher figure than what we're talking about here. We're talking about a lot less money that a student would be getting a percentage of. So it's a smaller percentage of a smaller number. So it'll be a significant savings in terms of administrative cost.
Follow up.
So I guess kind of follow up on that. So you're saying there is a fiscal impact then? I thought we heard that there's not a fiscal impact.
Okay. There is no fiscal impact because money right now that a student is generating for a school, there is a portion of that money now being used to cover administrative costs. They don't get administrative revenue from some other source. It comes from per pupil funding. So the funding, instead of going to the public school, a small percentage of that would then go to be deposited into the account, and a portion of that would be set aside for administrative costs. So there is no fiscal impact. It's actually a savings to the state in a way that increases per pupil revenue to the public school, and it does it by the student doesn't take all the money, and it's a smaller percentage of that amount set aside for administration rather than the larger amount of the current per pupil revenue that goes to the public school that's set aside for administrative costs.
If I could, perhaps another question. Along the similar line on page 10, we see here where it talks about the amount granted to the account shall be equal to 90% of the total state aid factors multiplied by the grade level weight and student category. Share with us, what are we talking about on state aid factors? Is that including ad valorem?
The calculated amount, that's a good question. So that the amount is the same no matter what school district you come from, the calculation is based on the total local and state aid amount. Doesn't include federal, doesn't include the money that goes teacher retirement off the top. It's just formula money. The base factor right now is a little over $3,000 for every student in the state. And then the weights that are added to that then make the amounts different for different students. So that's the basis of it. But then the payment itself comes only out of state aid.
Thank you. I think this is my last. But there is, ad valorem could be factored in. And I think in the Senate today they were talking, and Senator Jolly said, no, there's no ad valorem. But actually, ad valorem is part of the factor. And
in terms of the calculation to see what the percentage the student gets,
yes,
that maximum calculated amount includes the state and local sources. The payment comes only out of state aid money. So there is no local money used in making the deposit.
And this is my last one, if I may. Let me find it. It's referring to the 120% that's set aside. Share with us why 120% rather than 100%.
Well, because it's anticipating the potential for growth from one year to the next. So they would set aside 100% of what was applied for and received or applied for, and then there was not enough funds. They would take both of those and then add 20% to it to set aside for the beginning of the next school year.
Thank you. Representative Casey for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative, and I appreciate it. I'd asked you a lot of questions before, but as they ask questions, it comes up to another question. When you were talking about the ad valorem on the chargeables, even though that's raised locally from your school land, motor vehicles, gross production, REA, is that different than the ad valorem because it's administered back out by the state, even though it's raised locally? That was one of my questions.
The calculation is based on the money that is considered in the formula. If it's outside of the formula, it's not considered in the calculation in the bill. And I'm not sure I'm completely answering the question, so you might help me.
Okay, just going with, that's okay, thank you. Going with the ad valorem is a chargeable, okay? Right. These other ones I just described are chargeables. So my question is, if you're saying the ad valorem's staying within the district, that they're just getting the state aid, so you're taking that chargeable off, what about the other areas of chargeables? Or is that the same way, or is that...
Well, there's two things that happen here. And there's two things that happen. One is you have to make the calculation what is the maximum amount generated by that student when you consider the base factor, the grade weight, and the 4 student category weights. So then you get that amount. And that includes all the chargeables, it includes the state aid. When it comes time to actually make the deposit of the percentage of funds that student is eligible for, that amount of money comes solely out of state appropriated funds.
Okay. I understand. Another question, if I might? Okay. Just because families are really not set up on school calendars, and it might be in this bill, but I didn't see it, is it's not that unusual that our younger children at your school are more apt to be free and reduced. Just the economics of being a young family and working yourself up. As you get a little older, a lot of times the older kids, the parents are doing better financially, so therefore they go off of free and reduce. With the economy like we have, for an example, if I don't have a job, and let's say that oil and gas hopefully gets back up to a little higher level, and I get that job, how do you watch that periodically to see that, yes, I was eligible when I filled out my application, but I'm no longer eligible?
Once you're in the program, you would continue in the program. It's similar to the provision we have in the Henry Scholarship, that for continuity of education, you can continue in the program once eligibility has been established. Same with the Henry Scholarship. If you were on an IEP at one point and you met the qualifications to go into the program, once you're in it, you continue until you come back into the public school system. It would function the same way.
Oh, okay.
Follow up.
I mean, that's a tad bit scary, because if I was a college student and I had a family and I got out of college and I got a job that paid $150,000, you're saying we're still going to pay all the way through for them students?
Well, I don't
Because
consider
I can
putting
obviously
a,
afford that at this point in time. It wouldn't make sense that we would continue to pay into an educational savings account when, now that I'm using my degree, just clarification, please.
yeah, well, there's a body of research out there about the difficulty that kids go through when they have to move from one school to another or different learning environments. So when I mentioned the continuity of education, I mean, that is to make sure that we're not arbitrarily moving the student back. The student's succeeding in a particular environment. I wouldn't consider it scary saying that that student would be able to continue in that environment that was benefiting them. So, and it's not scary even, I think, from a funding level, because they're still receiving a percentage of a small amount of money, relatively speaking. The money that they're not receiving in deposit goes back into the formula, raising per pupil revenues. So it actually is a blessing both for the family who was able to, their child was able to continue in an environment they're being successful in. At the same time, the per pupil revenue is being enhanced in the public school.
Okay, just a point of clarification, and it doesn't matter what I make. As long as I qualify when my child's in first grade for the next 10 or 12 years, it doesn't matter if I hit the lottery. And I get $10 million, I still get that to go into my educational savings account.
Well, I don't, and this really gets to the idea of a double standard. What is okay with a program like this, and what people would like to see in a program like this, they would never apply to the public school, in the sense that if somebody wins the lottery now, they do not have to start paying the public school system to educate their child. There's money, no matter how rich or how poor you are, you can send your child to the public school and receive 100% of the formula funds. What we're saying is, if you want to use this program, you can take a percentage of that. You can't take the whole amount. You can take a percentage of that. So what, if the person is wealthy, why would they not have to pay in the public system, but then should be disqualified from participating in this program for pennies on the dollar? I don't see the logic in that when it does work as a benefit to the family and to the public school system.
One more follow-up.
Okay, and I don't disagree with what you're saying logically, but the bill basically is set up on what, I mean, you have the bill set up on a free and reduced account. I
Right.
guess that's my question, is if that's the reason it's set up, when a person no longer is eligible for that, should they be eligible for that? That was my question, but you answered it. I'm good.
Well, and again, I think if the interest is the individual child and that environment, and we're not making decisions based on institutional considerations, then it does make sense.
Representative Nolan for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is, if they get this card, you know, they've started their account, they get this card, and they're homeschooling, or maybe they're putting their child in a private school, and they decide midstream, hey, I don't want to do this, I want to go back to the public school. What happens to that money? I mean, does it stay with the private institution, or does the school get money back? I mean, how does that work?
That's a great question. Any amount of money that would be deposited into a savings account, first of all, is prorated for the amount of time the student was active in that program. So if they enter the program after the beginning of the school year, it's prorated. And if they go back into the public school system prior to the completion of the school year, it's prorated. The money they receive while they are active in the program is money that's why the money is being deposited. So if they don't spend all of it, they could continue to hold that money for post-secondary education, which is one of the functions of the bill. They would not have to give it back. And the money, and again, it's important to understand, there is no nexus here with private providers other than approval for the debit card. The agreement here is between the state and individual parents or families or legal guardians. So the private school is only paid for services rendered. A tutor would only be paid for services rendered. So there would be no getting money back from a private provider unless there was fraud, and there's provisions in the bill to account for that, to address that.
Follow-up.
Now, what are the provisions for fraud?
Well, it allows for up to prosecution. The state board can look into correcting it. The state board would make an initial determination, was it a misunderstanding or was there a mistake? But if they determine or have reason to believe there's fraud, then they can refer that to law enforcement. So and then they also have the ability, the state board does, to require surety bonds so that if there is some loss of taxpayer funds, there is a way to recoup that.
Follow up?
Okay. So, like the Oklahoma Access Card, I mean, we've had so many issues with fraud on it. So do you think this card would be better, I mean, easier to police than that one? Because that's been pretty tough.
Oh, I think it would be, because we're talking about, I think with food stamps, you know, 600 and some, well over 600,000 people using it. You're not going to have near that many people making use of this. And you're going to be limiting it to a much smaller group of potential vendors than you would every grocery store or convenience store in the state. So it's much more limited in scope and much more manageable.
Now, the Senate just passed a similar measure out of committee of Senate Bill 609, correct? Could you explain the differences between Senate bill and House bill?
I think there are a number of differences in the text itself, but principally the difference is this bill is focused on low-income families. The Senate bill has universal eligibility. Any person eligible to attend a public school would be qualified to receive 80% of the calculated amount and have that deposited into a savings account.
Representative Kern for a question. Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative, what is the, and I probably ought to know this, but just to refresh my memory, what is the amount required to, you know, that's the income is equal to or less that we're talking about? In the bill, you know, right here it says, if the total annual income is equal to or less than the amount required to qualify for the federal free or reduced. Do you know that amount?
I do. Hold on.
And I have a couple of follow-ups, Madam Chair, please.
For a family of four, the annual income for reduced price meals, which is 185% of the federal poverty level, that's $44,123. If you are in the group right above that, that is above free and reduced lunch level, but less than 1.5 times that amount, is $66,185, and you would be eligible to receive 60% of the calculated amount. And then between 1.5 and 2 times that amount is $88,246. You would be eligible to receive 30% of the calculated amount.
Follow up? Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, Representative, you said that this bill is a savings to the state. Is that correct? Did I understand you to say that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And another one, please, ma'am. Will it increase the per pupil amount in our public schools over and above what it is right now?
It does by definition. I mean, this is obviously a frequently asked question. It's a simple division problem. You have the total amount of money that we're talking about here divided by the total number of students in the system. When one student leaves, you lose 100% of that student, but you're only losing a percentage of the money. Exactly. So the numerator changes slower at a slower rate than the denominator. So when you do the division problem, the more kids that are in the program, the more you see a savings to the state. That money goes right back into the formula. It's set aside to do that. I've used an example where you evenly distribute 1,000 kids, a hypothetical group of 1,000 kids using the program, and a third would qualify at the different income levels. Out of 680,000 kids, roughly, that would increase per pupil revenue by about $2.54.
Follow up. Okay, and so will this also result in smaller classes in our public schools?
Well, it would certainly help control the issue that schools have where you have this burgeoning enrollment every year. So I don't know that it would actually reduce it. It would help control the rate of growth, but I don't see it anytime soon actually diminishing public school enrollment because the enrollment every year is really pretty astonishing, the increase.
Follow up. So, but you do see it as a means of curbing growth, you might say, and isn't that something that will be a benefit to a teacher so that their classroom does not continue to grow
And,
Yes, I think it does help in that regard.
and one last one, I
One
promise, this is my last one. Okay, so would you not agree? I see this bill as interjecting competition into the educational system, and education is in every other institution that we have in our society, and competition, would you not agree, usually helps all involved?
Yeah, and that's a great question. The Henry Scholarship, I think, is a great example of the possibility here. There were parents that began to use that in 2010 and had complained that they could get nowhere with the school, the public school. The moment they notified the school that they were about to leave and go on the Henry Scholarship, you had special ed directors calling families on Saturday saying, what can we do to keep you here? So you had an instant reaction that benefited those students. But I think, again, it's whether it's competition or not is a matter of perspective. In those cases, I think it was competition that helped. But I also see it as very complementary. One example I would use is Positive Tomorrows, which is a private school, most exclusive private school in the state that you've never heard of, maybe. They only take children that are homeless. And so that program certainly would complement what Oklahoma City Public Schools is trying to do for those kids, because those kids cost Oklahoma City Public Schools nothing. And it costs over $10,000 a year to educate those kids. So I know a lot of people have a tendency to think of, you know, some high-profile private school, but there are a lot of private schools doing amazing work with kids like this that I would consider to be a complement to what we're doing in the public school system.
Representative McDaniel for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to make sure I get this straight. So the more kids that leave the public school system for this option, the better it'll be for the kids left in the system, because we'll have smaller classrooms and more money to spend on them. Is that what we're saying?
Well, you definitely have more money. Now, whether it depends on the rate at which students are coming into the school system versus them leaving. But let me give you a very simple example. Let's say we spend $4 billion on public education, and we give a 50% scholarship, so the students that want to leave can take 50% of the money with them. And every single student leaves the system but one. So there's one remaining student in the public school system. What is their per pupil revenue? It's just over $2 billion, because it's just more than half of that amount. So the math works every time without exception.
Follow up?
Yeah.
Follow up?
On page 20, and you and I have had this discussion many times about accountability on Lindsay Nicole Henry Scholarship, because I know we don't go back and check test scores. And in the previous bill in here today, we've talked about we want tax dollars spent on the standards that we want for Oklahomans. And you and I have both been challenged to figure out, once these kiddos pop out to a private school, organization, or whatever it is where they're getting educated on tax dollars, where's the accountability factor? I see on page 20 you have the State Board of Education shall select an independent research organization, and they're going to start tracking these kids. And then they're going to, over a 3-year period, they are then going to compare kids of the equal socioeconomic level to see if these kids are getting educated or not. Is that the accessibility piece here?
Well, there's two different accountability pieces. One would be the financial accountability piece, and the other would be academic accountability. I think that's how I would break it down, and we've discussed the financial part. The academic accountability then becomes the job of the parent. And that's the way it is with the Henry Scholarship. If the parent's going to take the initiative, research, find a different way to educate their child, I think we would be loath to develop a system around the lowest common denominator rather than to respect the interest of parents in raising their child. We talk a lot about schools fail because of the lack of involvement of parents, or parents ought to be involved in this, that, and another thing. This is the ultimate in allowing the parent to make the decision. And the difference here is, earlier we were talking about accountability of an institution. Here we're talking about individual decisions, just like with Medicaid or higher ed tuition assistance, or when parents use subsidies for daycare. Parents make those decisions and, live with the results of that. But we do have a research component, so over time we can evaluate what's happening and perhaps make tweaks to the law.
Todd Thompson, Representative Thompson for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Nelson, I appreciate your work on this, and I appreciate your heart for where you're going. I think a question that I have, though, was on the a point you made at the very beginning that I haven't been able to get past, was the revenue that the child generated would go with them, and I'm having a problem with this child generating revenue, because isn't that really a misrepresentation? Because they don't generate revenue, they have a certain amount allocated to them, but they didn't generate that per se.
Well, and okay, I think I see your point, and they don't generate the revenue in the sense that they come up with it on their own. They do generate it for a public school. So if they are attending a public school, by virtue of the student attending that school, they generate so many funds through the formula. And if they were to move from Oklahoma City Public Schools to Tulsa Public Schools, that amount of money follows the student through the formula. So I'm talking about generating funds in that context.
Well, can I follow?
Yes.
Well, as a follow, I guess, because if it was truly that they generated funds, and my point being is that we don't appropriate money based on the per pupil basis. We appropriate to public education, and then a certain amount is designated per pupil to be distributed. Or else, if we did appropriate on a per pupil basis, then if we had an extra 20,000 kids, 30,000 kids, 40,000 kids come into the system, then that would be generating revenue for the entire system, because we would have said, hey, there's going to be X number of dollars per kid, but we don't do that. We just appropriate money for education, and then a certain amount is allocated per child. Does that make sense? Do you understand that?
Well, I see what you're saying. I think I would just see it differently, and yeah, we don't run a line item for every single student in the state. That would be cumbersome, but we do appropriate a big giant sum of money to be distributed through the formula on a per pupil basis. I mean, the formula was designed by the legislature to receive the funding that's appropriated every year, and it's divided on a per pupil basis, and schools receive funding on a per pupil basis from state and local funds. Now, federal funds, that may be a different story, but state and local funds are passed through to public schools on a per pupil basis, not a program basis.
Follow up?
I want to just kind of screw down on this, just because I want to make sure I'm seeing it clearly, or where we're different on this. I understand your point. My point being is that when we put a certain amount into there, if that number of students increases, the amount that goes per pupil that is distributed becomes less, because there's more students.
Absolutely.
So they don't, in effect, generate more income, because we're not appropriating on a per pupil basis up front before it goes in. Does that make sense? We don't look at, here's the state of Oklahoma, here's all the kids that are school age, and we have committed to give X number per child, and that's how we appropriate. Does that make sense?
Well, I think a lot of people would wonder how we make that decision anyway on an annual basis in terms of our appropriation and what the basis for that is. But you're right. I mean, we don't do a count, then we figure out how much we want per student and then appropriate based on that. That's absolutely correct.
And then my last question.
Yes.
That we've had many reforms out here, and I think I've even heard you say, we need to make sure that a high school diploma means something. So we've implemented a lot of these reforms. We did the A through F under the whole pretense that we have to let parents have a good perception a good description and idea of where to go. Would it not make sense then, if tax dollars are going to a private school, that they would then need to be a part of the A through F, that they would then need to be part of the TLE, that they would then, because as much as what you're saying is that a parent can figure it out on their own, but we haven't really assumed that they can figure it out on their own with the public school.
Well, and that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. And one of the big distinction there is going to be, one, government employees are directing the money and how the money's spent. Maybe with input with the parents, maybe not, I don't know. And then the plan here is, if parents want to participate in the program, they're now making the decisions. So the difference And accountability is who's making the decision. If a third party is making the decision, we as the legislature, ultimately having responsibility for the public school system, need to regulate that. If the parent's making a decision on behalf of their child, you would need less regulation. There's still regulation here for the parents that use this, but it's significantly less than it would be for a public school. Because one is an individual, done on an individual basis, one is done on an institutional basis, where a third party is making the purchase and making the decisions. It's the difference between a third party purchase and a first party purchase in terms of the accountability.
All right, thank you. Representative Stone for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is there any requirement in the bill for private school to have accreditation?
There is. Private schools would have to be accredited through the Oklahoma Private School Accrediting Council.
I guess I'm still concerned somewhat over the bill, and that anybody on this committee voting for it could be hypocritical, and that these state dollars could follow the kid to a private school, which could then be used to teach AP US history or...
And again, I think I would point to the answer that I just gave. I don't know how else to explain it. We're talking about one is an institution. When my kids are happily in a public school and will continue to be in a public school. So, but that, we're not making the daily decisions about what courses to teach and what the content of that course is and the teacher that teaches that course. I mean, our students are assigned to a school, the teachers are hired by somebody else. If you're using this program, you are making those decisions in first person. This is not a third party decision that's being made. That is the difference. So if a parent's not happy with the AP course and they're using this program, well, then they need to just make the change. If my kids go to a public school and I'm not happy with the AP course, do I have to move? Do I have to try to find some kind of open transfer? The dynamic of the decision is significantly different.
Representative Hankey for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Nelson, if a school agrees to accept these funds, are they mandated to take all students that want to go to their school?
No, we've actually fashioned this on the open transfer law where public schools don't have to take every child. The resident public school does have to take every child, but if you want to go on open transfer to a different public school, they get to be selective. It would function the same way.
So then what's the criteria for admittance?
Well, it's up to that school. I mean, different private schools have different missions. They would make up their criteria. They can't discriminate. It's follow federal law in terms of not discriminating. But what's the basis of a non-resident public school making that decision? We really leave it up to that non-resident public school what their criteria is. Some do it by lottery. If you're going to do open transfer, you really can't tell because most of them don't have a written policy to allow them discretion without having to follow a written policy on what students they accept, and we wanted to give the same courtesy to any private school or private provider that wanted to serve these children.
Is there a possibility that schools would then be able to kind of cherry pick their students, maybe somebody that is exceptional in sports or...
Well, I wish Representative Cleveland were in here to give a long answer to that question about sports, because I'm not an expert, but the Oklahoma Secondary Schools Athletic Association would still govern transfers and those kinds of things to prohibit that. But that could happen right now within the public system in terms of open transfer. That sports would be governed by that association. But again, public schools, non-resident public schools cherry pick the kids that come in. I mean, I've talked to a lot of parents that, an open transfer, they can't get an open transfer for their kid for all kinds of reasons. A lot of times it's special education because they just don't have the capacity. They may not have the special education program that would suit that child. You'd have the same situation with private schools. So we don't require anything of the private schools. We don't require of non-resident public schools in terms of transfer.
One more question.
Okay. As far as how this has taken effect in Florida and Arizona, have they seen a savings, or have they actually spent more money and had to allocate more money than they thought.
Thanks for raising that question. I know a lot of the emails we got showed, well, it's not revenue neutral. Well, I've not read the Florida law. I did base this initial draft last year off of the Arizona law that I received from Arizona lawmakers that drafted it. And my understanding is with those laws, they allow students that are already in a private school or in a private setting to come in and get the money or just apply for the money. Here, it functions like the Henry Scholarship, where you have to have already been in the public school system. We have to know that you're out there and you'd be generating funds, or bad word choice, Representative Thompson, I'm sorry, but there'll be some per pupil revenue stream coming to the public school for you before you would then be qualified to participate here. So you won't just have this massive group of kids in private school that can show up and take this money. So that may account for that difference.
At this point, because we still do have a long list of people in the queue, we will restrict it to no additional ones than those that are already in the queue, and would ask that you just ask one question, please. And so we'll call on Representative Strom for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Nelson, we've heard a lot of discussion today about local control. And I think we would probably all agree that education is structured to teach our children. I mean, we're doing this for the children. And so my question would be, with the discussion and the emphasis on local control, and if we do, I'll phrase it as this question: do you believe that the parents are best suited to make these educational decisions for the children? And if so, does this bill allow them to make that decision?
Yes and yes.
All right, thank you. Representative Nolan for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, so I'm going to try to phrase all my questions in one. Are you ready? Okay. It's about homeschool students. I mean, if a homeschool student decides to participate in this system, then would they have record of them? Because I would think they would, because they're receiving these cards. Would they be able to track those students then, because they have record of them? Would they be subject to audits if they receive these cards? And would there be any requirements for accreditation? Ta-da!
Very good. I'll do my best. One, again, there's an important distinction. There's a phrase in here that's taken straight out of the state constitution that unless other means of education is provided, that is the euphemism in the Constitution for homeschooling. At the request of the Oklahoma Homeschool Association, we have specifically in the bill excluded them. They are not involved, cannot participate by choice. But you can use this program. You can use this program to purchase curriculum materials, whatever you need to educate your child at home. So you can do something that looks a lot like it. You just would not be a traditional homeschooler where you're paying for it yourself and there is no nexus with the government. Here, if you were to use this program, there is a nexus with the government because you're receiving part of the per pupil funds for that student. So there is tracking in that sense. I mean, you have to every year provide a standardized test, the results of a standardized test to the state in order to be able to continue in the program for the next school year. That initially would be to allow us to take a look and see how the program is functioning, and are there different, better ways of educating a kid outside the public school system, and which could lead to tweaks in the law. And then certainly if we see that there's fraud or there's problems with these test results as they come in, we would have an opportunity to do something with the law at that point. There would be financial accountability, even in real time. But in terms of academic accountability, it really is left up to the parents with the research component requiring the test, the standardized test, to be submitted annually.
Representative Rogers for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Nelson, under our current system, if I have and I've got 3 boys in public school, so I'll use them as a reference. Say I've got 3 boys in public school and I feel like they're getting underserved or they're getting bullied or whatever the case might be, and I can't afford private school, and say me and my wife don't feel adequate enough to homeschool them. Right now, my current option is just to completely move out of the district and take 100% of those dollars to another district. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Representative Candidate for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What I'm looking at, and help me understand, on page 20, where it talks about the State Board of Education shall select an independent research organization. What is the purpose of this research organization? Because it talks about beginning the third year, talking about research and year-to-year learning gains. Is this the purpose of accountability in this? And then they're using nationally normed test results. Is that correct?
I would not, at this point, consider this to be accountability. I would consider this to be research. I mean, it is just simply for research purposes. And the 3 years is to allow some kind of a time horizon where you can actually begin to have a comparison between years. But we leave it up to the board to determine who that might be. It could be one of the public universities here or a private research organization that would help us analyze what the effects of this program have been. As policymakers, we would have that information.
Representative Condit for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Nelson, I want you to try to help me understand something. If I understand it correctly, these lower income parents would have an account set up for them. I'm going to try to be like Representative Nolan and phrase several questions into one question.
I'll get my pen out. There we go.
And let's set the scenario of at the beginning of a year, parents decide to send their children to private school, which is fine, and so they set up this savings account. Is the savings account, multiple questions here, is the savings account preloaded at the beginning of the year for the whole year? And if so, what happens when that child, at the end of the first semester, the parents say, whoa, wait a minute, we weren't given what we thought we would get, we can't afford to send them. Now then they go back to public school, but yet they've used all the appropriated dollars for that child. So could you help me understand that?
Yeah, good question. It would not function as you described. I mean, they don't get it front loaded. It would be, the bill specifically requires that the deposits be made no less often than quarterly, but could be monthly. It's left up to the board to set that schedule. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's prorated. So if you begin after the beginning of the school year, you don't receive money for that time period where you were in the public school. And if you return to the public school before the conclusion of the year, that would, of course, again, is prorated. So you're only receiving funds for that period of time that you were actively involved or engaged in the program. So there is no, need to go get money back. I mean, because it's the money that's deposited represents the actual time the student was involved in the program. If they go back to the public school, it would just be like if with any transfer under the circumstances.
Representative Caldwell for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Nelson, about 2 weeks ago or so, I spent a day and a half with my local public school system at a strategic planning session. One thing I took from that session, or from that day and a half, was that every child learns differently and deserves an individualized education. If you agree with that statement, could you see any certain situation where a public school may not be the best suited to provide that individualized education, but due to financial constraints, a parent would have no other choice but to remain in that public school? And does your bill potentially solve that problem?
I think that's a great point to make. I think people perceive this as a criticism of public schools, and I think this is a reform that's significantly different than recent reforms. This is a bottom-up reform. It's not a top-down reform. We're not telling local schools what to do. And I have visited with a lot of school administrators, a lot of teachers. I've actually toured a lot of schools, talked to a lot of kids. I think part of the frustration of educators generally with a lot of the reforms is that we've asked them to do the impossible, and we get frustrated when they can't do it. So it's not a criticism to say that in some circumstances you're not going to be able to meet a student's needs. I mean, it's just reality. So in those cases, this would allow those parents, would give them an option they would not otherwise be able to afford. If you're well-to-do or you have the means, you've already made these decisions. You've either moved or your child's in a private school. You've been able to do that. But if you're, part of the 62% of the kids in public schools that are on free and reduced lunch, that is not a realistic option. And your student just has to continue to sit there and suffer if you're not able to move to a different district or to get an open transfer in the public system. So on the margins, it does exactly what you described, and in a way that doesn't hurt anybody, but actually benefits both parties in a financial way.
Well, Representative Nolan, you sneaked in on me, but just one little bitty question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate it. We keep hearing how this is really good for public schools, and I wondered if I could respectfully request that we have someone who represents one of our public school organizations to come up, maybe Ryan Owens or somebody who could tell us how this might impact funding in regard to public schools.
All right, Mr. Owens, you have
And then, Madam Chair, if I might, if we're going to do that, then I have several people in favor of the bill that I would request to have speak.
I think that is only fair. Mr. Owens, if you will come up for, say, 2 minutes, and then we'll allow you any number you want for 2 total minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and Representative Nolan for the shout-out. Wasn't really expecting that and hadn't prepared for it. But on behalf of COSA, which is the group that represents school administrators, and the Suburban Schools Association, USSA, I would say we do have grave concerns with this bill. Not that we don't want to meet the individual needs of students, but we want to ensure that if we create a dual system to provide education for students, that it have the same accountability system that we placed on our public schools. I just don't think we can have it both ways. I think if our taxpayer dollars are going to support any type of education system, then as a taxpayer, I need to be able to use the accountability system that this legislature has created to help me know if I've made a wise investment, or if you all have made a wise investment with my taxpayer funds. So I would encourage you to look at it from that angle of equitable accountability. In terms of funding, there is a Politico report out that investigated these programs in Arizona and in Florida, and in both states they found ESAs are not revenue neutral. They actually end up costing the state more because you're bringing students on who are not originally served by the public schools. And so you have to ensure that you're not bringing students from the homeschool or private schools, which page 4 and 5 of this bill says that a student need only be eligible to attend a public school in Oklahoma, not that they be enrolled in one. And so we do have concerns with bringing more students in who were not previously served. We'd be happy to sit down and work through those concerns if this bill passes, but given this opportunity, wanted to make our viewpoint known. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Representative Nelson, now, any number that you want, but for a total of 2 minutes. Do you
Well, and I want to address some of that because, I guess you can't make some of these points enough, the factual points anyway. In Florida, the structure of the program is different. Here, students will have had to be in the public school the prior year to generate funding. That is probably a clear difference. Somebody did text me since I answered the question a while ago that actually in, I think it's Florida, it's actually a separate line item. So from that standpoint, it is an increased cost of the state. That is not the case here. What we're talking about is students are able to take a percentage of the money we're already spending on them to a different education location, but the money's still being used to educate the child. And again, it's the institutional versus the individual here. We do, as a state, we have the responsibility under the Constitution to run a system of public schools, but there's also a requirement that we have, the compulsory attendance requirement in the Constitution, that if we don't provide for that at a public school, that we need to provide for it at some other school. And that's exactly what the bill does. It's been envisioned in the state Constitution, and that's what we're doing.
You don't get into debate here.
Well, I'm just answering the questions that the statements that just came up.
All right.
And why we say we don't want to have it was mentioned we don't want to have it both ways, that's exactly what I'm trying to do here. This is not a revolutionary idea. This is based on things we've done in the state for decades. subsidized state subsidies for daycare. Parents can choose wherever they want to go. Higher ed tuition assistance, the OTEG system, is state money only for private higher education institutions to subsidize those institutions, in fact. The money is paid directly to the institution. So if you're between the age of 5 and 18, this is the only place we don't do it. Medicaid. You can take it to any willing provider, any open hospital. You don't have to go to the public hospital down the street. You can go anywhere. Food stamps, you don't have to go to the government grocery store. The only place where the state provides an individual benefit where you have to go to the government institution to use it is for 5-year-olds to 18-year-olds in K-12 education. So we have had it both ways for a long time. Let's let parents be parents, and if they aren't satisfied, then they can take a portion of the money with them. That's, I think, completely consistent with the practice of the state historically, and so I just wanted to correct those couple of things.
All right. And you still have 2 minutes for an outside speaker if you would like to.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we'll have time, but I've got 3 people really that I would like to have talk.
But we still have debate coming up.
Yeah, yeah, looking forward to that.
Go right ahead, Representative.
I would like to introduce Susan Ogle, who is in charge of Positive Tomorrows, the very exclusive private school that I mentioned earlier. If you would allow her just within with 30 seconds to a minute, describe the kind of partnership Positive Tomorrows has with Oklahoma City Public School in serving homeless children.
Yes, thank you.
One of the things that I think, first of all, thank you for having me and for allowing me the opportunity to speak just a minute. We see our program as being a complement to what the Oklahoma City Public Schools does. We take children who are living in deep poverty, kindergarten through 5th grade, and work to help them get up to speed, both academically and socially. And at the same time, we work with the families. We case manage the families. We get them the resources that they need to help them find housing, better income, and better employment opportunities. We do this not so that we will keep a child during that whole time period. If we were to have a child at our school between kindergarten and 5th grade, that whole time period, we would consider ourselves a failure. It's our goal to we keep children for a year, 18 months or so, stabilize that family, get that child so they're successful in public school. We can move them into public school and they'll do well. And that's really what we're about. We see ourselves as a good complement. We need to serve more kids. We turned away 109 kids last year, and there are 2,500 homeless children in the Oklahoma City Public School District. We need to be able to serve more kids and be able to assist the public schools by doing so.
Thank you very much, and you still have 43 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
For another speaker.
Well, thank you. I think Renee Porter's in here, and she spoke on this issue last year, and if she has something she would like to add, I'd like to give her that opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Renee Alvarado Porter. There has never been, nor will there ever be, a parent who doesn't want a better future for their child. As parents, we pour ourselves into making sure that our children succeed. The desire doesn't exist more for the rich or the poor, whether you live rural or urban, or for one race more than another. I run a community development corporation where I am the CEO, where our mission is to serve low-income people. I care deeply about this bill as well, and I wanted to see it pass, and I'd like to ask for your yes vote on it, because as a Hispanic, there are too many minorities who are low income in our communities who don't have an opportunity for another choice, for another option for them to be able to identify a way out and a path, and education is exactly that. So please vote yes for this.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We appreciate that. Representative Nelson, do you have anything else you want to say in about 20 seconds?
Not that'll fit in 20 seconds.
Okay, well, you'll have opportunity for debate. Do I hear a motion? Okay, I heard a second. Will there be debate? All right, Canaday, McDaniel. Canaday and McDaniel, any others against the bill? All right, for the bill. Representative Nelson. So, Representative Newell, will you please begin our debate? For the bill, for the bill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, parents, and not just rich parents, have the right to send their children to the school of their choice. We talk about a lot local control. This is the ultimate local control, and I would urge members to vote for this bill. A question was brought up earlier about the idea of generating revenue. It's important to note that I have heard school administrators and others have heard school administrators literally refer to students as revenue generators. I would offer to you that's one of the reasons that the establishment is against this bill, because they're afraid of losing those revenue generators. I would share with you that the majority of Oklahomans and 63% of parents with school-age children are in favor of education savings accounts. And as Representative Nelson brought up earlier, we do this already with so many other things, state dollars going to private institutions. We have public roads, but they're built by private contractors.
5 seconds.
I urge you to vote for the bill.
Representative Canaday against the bill for 90 seconds.
Thank you very much, Madam. Members, I'm speaking against this bill as a representative of the following counties, which are primarily rural, and that is LaFleur, Sequoia, Haskell, McIntosh, and Pittsburgh County. This bill will not be applicable to them, only a very small percentage. In the TLE, we had exemptions made for those school districts that had over 33,000 students. Why are we not making exemptions? If this is addressing an Oklahoma City and Tulsa problem, let's make it for that, just like we make exemptions on the TLE Commission. I guess I'm, as a former teacher, school board member when I was in private business, as an administrator, and we talk about individual accountability of our teachers and our schools. I've seen it applied. I don't think our public schools are going amiss on this. And this, I'm afraid, is a slippery slope that may very well take away from what we've worked so hard to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Representative Brumbaugh for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The fact of the reality is, folks, nobody cares more about children than their parents. And what do we do with parents who are locked into poverty, into failing school systems? They want a way out for their children. I hear all the comments about revenue generators and whatnot, and as someone who sends his children to private schools and watches the success rates there, I pay twice for education, twice. And I hear those comments all the time. This is a great bill. It's just like a Coverdale savings account where the children own the account, the parents are the custodians, and they can use it for higher education when they move on. I urge you to vote for this bill.
Thank you very much. Representative McDaniel for 1.5 minutes, 90 seconds.
Thank you, Madam
Against
Chairman.
the bill.
Members, I truly value public education. For those of you that have been here 10 years, I believe it's the backbone of the middle class. And it saddens me to hear people want out. They're looking for a way out of public education. And maybe I live in Lake Wobegon, but I wish public education could do all the things that you all want. Help homeless kids in my district, we try to do that. My conscience won't allow me to put this on poor kids, because when they go out of our system, at least I know in our system, we have accountability. We do have TLE. We have accreditation. We have standards. You take these kiddos into private schools or wherever they're going to go, and these are kids, I don't think one of us that sits in our chamber qualifies for this program. I may be wrong. I don't think we do. But I can't go to bed at night knowing they may be someplace not getting what we require in public education. This is like private prisons in DOC. Private prisons can do it cheaper. You bet they can. Do they get all the amenities they get in DOC? We don't give many in DOC, but we do have a few, and we do have some accountability. Please take this back and study it. You're opening a door and sending kids to places, and we don't know what's going to be happening there. I think this bill has a lot of good ideas. At this time, I think it needs a lot of work. The accountability is on how you qualify for the program. It is not for where you're sending these kids every day. Thank you. Please vote no.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to make one point here. It was mentioned about prisons and private prisoners, and I think sometimes parents feel like that's what they're in. The difference between a private prison situation and what we're talking about here is the prisoners are there involuntarily. We're talking about the value of this is determined by the parents. And I don't think they're going to take it too lightly when it's their children that are involved. A few years ago, the state hospital down the street was run by the state. And they've changed it where it's now run by a private operator and you get world-class health care. I know this because we go there. You don't have to go to the government institution to get the services. This is the only place we do this. We require people to go to the government institution. And it doesn't work for everybody. We're just saying for these parents who have no other means to do this, let's give them a shot.
Mr. Speaker, we have held this open so that you can vote yes or no.
I vote aye.
All right.
My iPad, Madam Chairman, or?
No, that's okay. We'll do it without that. All right. Representative Nelson, with a tie vote of 9-9, I'm afraid that your bill does not pass. Thank you very much for your presentation.